Everyone told you Bryan Kohberger was the perfect suspect, a criminology PhD student who studied how killers think, a man who posted online asking criminals how they avoided getting caught, a loner, an obsessive, someone who, according to the prosecution, had been circling that house for months before he walked in and killed 4 people. The media ran with that story. It was clean. It was simple. It made sense. But here's the problem with clean, simple stories in murder cases. Reality is almost never clean. Reality is almost never simple. And when you take everything the prosecution has said about Bryan Kohberger's psychology and hold it up against what actual forensic psychologists say about how real killers behave, the picture gets complicated very fast. Today we are going to do something that almost no true crime channel has done with this case. We are going to apply real criminal profiling methodology to Bryan Kohberger, not the Hollywood version, not the TV version. The actual science used by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, by forensic psychologists, by criminal profilers who have spent decades studying the minds of people who kill. And by the end of this video, you are going to have to decide something for yourself, because the psychological profile of Bryan Kohberger does not fit neatly into guilty or innocent. It fits into something far more uncomfortable than either of those answers. If you are new here, this channel covers true crime cases with the details and the depth that mainstream coverage skips entirely. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the Kohberger trial is going to be one of the defining criminal cases of this decade, and I will be covering every single development as it happens. And before we go any further, comment below with your honest answer, based purely on what you already know about Bryan Kohberger. Do you think his personality fits the profile of someone capable of what happened at 1122 King Road? Yes or no? Because your gut answer right now and your answer at the end of this video may be very different things. Let's start with who Bryan Kohberger actually is. Not the prosecution's version, not the defense's version, the documented, verifiable facts about this man before. November 13, 2022. Bryan Kohberger was born in 1994 in the Pocono Mountains region of Pennsylvania. By most accounts, his childhood was unremarkable in the ways that matter for criminal profiling. No documented history of childhood abuse. No known incidents of animal cruelty. One of the most reliable early indicators of violent behavior according to the FBI's own research into serial offenders. No juvenile record. His family by all available accounts was stable. His parents have stood by him since his arrest and have made no public statements suggesting they believe he was capable of this crime. That is not evidence of innocence. Parents have stood by guilty children throughout history, but it is part of the documented picture of who Bryan Kohberger was before the night of November 13th in high school. Bryan struggled socially. He was overweight, introverted, and did not fit easily into peer groups. Former classmates have described him as quiet, awkward, someone who faded into the background rather than someone who pushed his way to the front. He did not have a wide social circle. He did not participate heavily in extracurricular activities. He was, by most accounts, a young man who existed at the margins of the social world around him. This is relevant not because introverted people become killers. The vast majority of introverted people live entirely peaceful lives, but because social isolation in adolescence combined with other specific factors is one of the variables forensic psychologists examined when constructing a psychological profile. Isolation alone means nothing. Isolation combined with specific behavioral patterns can mean something. We are going to come back to this distinction repeatedly, because it is the distinction the prosecution is hoping the jury does not make. In his early 20s, Bryan Kohberger underwent a significant physical transformation. He lost a substantial amount of weight. He began working out with what people who knew him described as near-obsessive dedication. He became, by external appearance, a genuinely different person from the overweight teenager he had been. Photographs from his high school years and photographs from his time at Washington State University show someone who looks almost unrecognizable as the same individual. Forensic psychologists flag dramatic physical reinvention in the late teens and early 20s as potentially significant in a profile, not because losing weight predicts violence, obviously it does not, but because it can indicate someone who is deeply dissatisfied with their prior identity and is actively constructing a new one. People who reinvent themselves dramatically are often people who feel that who they were was fundamentally unacceptable to themselves or to others, and who have decided to become someone else entirely. That psychological drive to shed a prior self that felt inadequate can be a healthy and positive force. It can also, in specific circumstances and in combination with other factors, reflect an unstable sense of self that becomes relevant when we examine behavior under stress. Bryan went to DeSales University in Pennsylvania, where he studied criminal justice. He was, by academic standards, a strong student. He then pursued a PhD in criminology at Washington State University, one of the better criminology programs in the Pacific Northwest. He was interested in the minds of criminals. He wanted to understand deviant behavior from the inside out. He wrote academic papers on criminal cognition and decision-making. His professors at Washington State have described him as intellectually serious, thorough, and engaged with the material in ways that went beyond surface-level curiosity. And here is where the prosecution and the defense diverge sharply on what that academic history means. The prosecution's argument is straightforward. Bryan Kohberger was obsessed with crime and criminals. He studied how they thought. He studied how they got caught. And then, according to the prosecution, he used that knowledge to plan and execute what he believed would be a near-perfect attack on 4 students, choosing victims in a location he knew, using a weapon that could not be easily traced, wearing clothing that would leave no fiber evidence, and taking steps to avoid the most obvious patterns that would link him to the scene. That narrative sounds compelling on its surface. But forensic psychologists who have reviewed this case publicly have raised a question that the prosecution has not adequately answered, and it is a question that cuts right to the heart of the psychological argument. If Bryan Kohberger was so knowledgeable about criminal investigation, so deeply aware of how killers get caught, why did he do almost everything that a knowledgeable person would know not to do? Think about this carefully because it is the central psychological paradox of this case. The prosecution claims Bryan Kohberger circled the house 12 times over several months, 12 times, in his own registered vehicle, in a college town equipped with traffic cameras, security cameras, and the kind of ambient surveillance infrastructure that exists in every American city and town in 2022. A criminology student who had studied criminal investigations would know, as a matter of basic academic knowledge, that vehicles are tracked, that license plates are recorded, that surveillance camera networks are extensive and overlapping in ways that most civilians do not appreciate. He allegedly used a fixed-blade knife with a distinctive military-style sheath and then left that sheath at the scene, a sheath bearing microscopic amounts of DNA. A criminology student writing a dissertation on criminal behavior would know, again as a matter of basic academic knowledge, that touch DNA is recoverable from surfaces, that forensic genealogy has closed cold cases decades old, that leaving any biological material at a crime scene is one of the most consequential mistakes an offender can make. He allegedly drove to the house in his own car, the same car that had already been documented near the location 12 times and that was registered in his name. And then he allegedly used his own phone, which he turned off during the murders, but which had already been pinging cell towers near the house 12 times before the murders, creating a months-long digital record of his presence in the area that investigators could and did use to build their case. A criminology PhD student, someone who, according to the prosecution's own narrative, specifically studied how investigators catch killers, specifically researched the mistakes offenders make, and specifically sought information from people with criminal experience about how to avoid detection, and he left his DNA at the scene, drove his own traceable vehicle there repeatedly, created a digital footprint that led directly to him, and left a key piece of evidence on the bed of one of his victims. This is the behavioral inconsistency that forensic experts have identified as the most troubling aspect of the prosecution's psychological argument, because it does not add up. A sophisticated, knowledgeable offender who planned this attack carefully over months does not make these mistakes. These are the mistakes of someone who either believed they were untouchable and beyond being caught, someone with severe narcissistic traits who overestimated their invulnerability, or someone who was not thinking clearly at all, someone acting from impulse and emotional overwhelm rather than calculation and planning. Or, and the defense will make this argument clearly, these are not the mistakes of the person who committed this crime at all. They are the coincidental patterns of an unusual man who happened to be in the area, happened to drive past the house multiple times for reasons unrelated to murder, and whose DNA ended up on a piece of evidence through a transfer pathway that had nothing to do with being at that house on that night. Let's talk about the online posts, because the prosecution has made significant use of the fact that Bryan Kohberger allegedly posted in online communities asking people with criminal experience about how they had avoided detection after committing crimes. Presented in isolation, this sounds alarming. A man who would later be accused of murder, asking criminals how they escaped justice. The implication the prosecution wants the jury to draw is obvious. He was doing research, he was planning, he was preparing. But here is the context that changes the meaning of those posts entirely, and that the defense will hammer relentlessly in front of the jury. Bryan Kohberger was a criminology PhD student conducting academic research on criminal cognition and decision-making. His dissertation research centered specifically on understanding how people who commit crimes think about risk, how they rationalize their behavior to themselves, how they perceive the likelihood of being caught, and how those perceptions influence their decisions before and during criminal acts. This is a legitimate and actively studied area of criminological research. Understanding criminal cognition from the perspective of the offender is foundational to developing better crime prevention strategies, better interrogation techniques, and better predictive models for law enforcement. Reaching out directly to people with criminal experience to ask them about their thought processes is not just something a criminology student might do. It is something criminology students are explicitly trained to do. It is called qualitative primary source research. It involves recruiting research participants from populations that have direct experience with the phenomenon you are studying. If you are studying criminal decision-making, people who have made criminal decisions are your primary sources. This is no different from a medical researcher interviewing patients about their experience of a disease, or a historian interviewing survivors about their experience of a war. The prosecution is presenting standard academic research methodology as evidence of criminal intent. They are taking something that has a clear and innocent explanation rooted in Bryan Kohberger's documented academic work and asking the jury to ignore that explanation in favor of a more sinister interpretation. The defense is going to call academic experts who will explain exactly what criminology PhD research looks like in practice, and they are going to make the prosecution's use of these posts look like what it is, an attempt to make academic curiosity seem like criminal planning. Now let's talk about the stalking evidence, because this is the piece of the prosecution's psychological case that deserves the most careful examination. Because if it holds up, it changes the entire picture significantly. The 12 sightings of the white Hyundai Elantra near 1122 King Road between August and November 2022 are the foundation of the prosecution's argument that Bryan Kohberger was engaged in predatory stalking behavior toward the specific victims in that house. They are presenting this as the behavioral signature of a fixated offender, someone who had identified specific targets and was engaged in the kind of escalating surveillance behavior that reliably precedes violent attack in documented cases. Forensic behavioral analysis of predatory stalking cases that culminate in homicidal violence has identified consistent behavioral patterns that appear repeatedly across documented cases. Stalkers who eventually commit violence almost always escalate their contact behavior over time. They move from passive observation to attempted communication, to more direct confrontation behavior, to the final violent act. The escalation is typically documented across multiple channels. There are messages, there are social media interactions, there are witnesses who saw the stalker near the victim's location and remember it because the behavior seemed unusual or threatening. There are often prior incidents that victims reported to police or mentioned to friends before the attack actually happened. In the Kohberger case, investigators have not publicly identified evidence of any of those standard escalation patterns. There are no documented communications between Bryan Kohberger and any of the 4 victims. Not a single text message, not a social media follow or interaction. Not an email, not a witness who remembered seeing Kohberger approaching or interacting with any of the 4 students before the night of the attack. None of the victims or their friends, in any of the interviews conducted after the murders, mentioned Bryan Kohberger by name or description as someone who had been bothering them, making them uncomfortable, or behaving in a way that concerned them. In virtually every documented predatory stalking case that ends in homicidal violence, the victim or people in the victim's immediate social circle have some awareness of the stalker before the attack. That awareness ranges from vague discomfort to active fear, but it is almost always present in some form because predatory stalkers who are fixating on specific victims almost always make their presence known in ways that leak into the social environment around the target. That pattern appears to be entirely absent from this case, and its absence is something forensic experts have flagged as inconsistent with the prosecution's stalking narrative. The prosecution will argue that its absence simply means Bryan Kohberger was more careful than most, that he observed from a greater distance, that he chose purely passive surveillance over active contact precisely because of his criminological knowledge. That is a possible explanation, but it is also the kind of explanation that can be offered to explain away any absence of evidence whatsoever, which makes it scientifically weak and should make a careful jury deeply cautious about accepting it. Here's what forensic criminal profiling actually tells us about the behavioral signature of the crime itself, separate from any question about who committed it, because the crime scene evidence has its own psychological story to tell. And that story is important and has not been adequately covered in mainstream true crime discussions of this case. The attack at 1122 King Road has several distinctive behavioral features that forensic profilers have noted publicly. First, the method. A knife, a large fixed-blade tactical knife used in close physical contact with 4 separate victims. This is significant because firearms allow distance between the killer and the victim. Knives do not. A person who chooses a knife as their weapon of choice for a mass killing is choosing intimacy with the act. They are choosing to be physically close to each victim, to remain in that physical proximity through the entire attack on each person. Forensic psychologists have identified the choice of a knife in a setting where firearms were available as indicating either a specific motivation related to the physical nature of the method, a deliberate choice to avoid the noise of gunshots in a residential area, or both simultaneously. Second, the evidence of overkill. The coroner's descriptions of the attack, released through court proceedings, indicate that the force used exceeded what was necessary to cause death. Forensic psychologists interpret overkill consistently across hundreds of documented cases as an indicator of personal emotional intensity toward the victim or the act itself. Overkill is not the signature of someone executing a plan efficiently and clinically. It is the signature of someone acting from intense emotion, rage, passion, or a combination of psychological states that override the calculation of sufficient force. Overkill says something important and specific about how the killer felt about what they were doing. Third, the targeting pattern. Kaylee and Maddie on the third floor, Shanna and Ethan on the second floor. Two surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, who were not harmed. The killer navigated a 3-story house in the dark, moved between 2 separate floors, killed 4 people, and left 2 others alive in the same building. Whether the 2 survivors were simply not encountered or were deliberately spared is a question the investigation has not definitively answered publicly. But the specificity of the targeting suggests either that the killer had a specific reason for targeting those 4 individuals and not the others, or that something interrupted the attack before it was completed, or that the killer simply did not encounter Dylan and Bethany's locations during the attack. Each of those possibilities carries different and significant psychological implications. Specific targeting implies pre-existing knowledge of or fixation on specific individuals. Interrupted attack implies something went wrong. Not encountering the survivors implies either luck or specific advanced knowledge of who was where in the house that night. Fourth, and perhaps most psychologically significant, the fact that Shanna Kernodle was awake at the time of the attack. Shanna ordered food on DoorDash at 4 a.m. She was on her phone. She was conscious and aware. Investigators believe she heard something and spoke before the attack began. A killer who was primarily motivated by avoiding detection and minimizing risk would typically retreat when they realized their target was awake and aware and capable of screaming, fighting back, and alerting others in the house. The killer at 1122 King Road did not retreat. They proceeded. That speaks to either extreme desperation, extreme emotional commitment to what they were doing, or extreme confidence in their ability to complete the attack regardless of resistance. None of these behavioral signatures map cleanly onto the psychological profile that the prosecution has constructed of Bryan Kohberger, a calculated, academically sophisticated offender who had planned this attack carefully over months. Would typically choose victims who were asleep and unable to resist or alert others. They would select timing and conditions that minimized risk and maximized control. The overkill and the willingness to attack a conscious victim who could alert the entire house suggest emotional dysregulation and risk tolerance that is inconsistent with careful knowledge-based planning. And yet, Bryan Kohberger's documented personality presentation, the flat effect, the analytical orientation, the emotional detachment that multiple people who knew him have described, does not fit the profile of someone acting from emotional dysregulation either. People who kill in states of extreme emotional intensity typically display signs of that intensity in their daily behavioral history. They have documented patterns of explosive anger, emotional volatility, situations where they lost control in ways that were witnessed and remembered by others. Bryan Kohberger's documented history does not contain those behavioral patterns in any publicly available record. So the behavioral evidence from the crime scene and the behavioral evidence from Bryan Kohberger's life before the crime point in somewhat different psychological directions. And that gap, that inconsistency between the crime scene profile and the suspect's documented behavioral history, is something that forensic psychologists cannot resolve cleanly, and that the defense is going to use to argue that the person whose psychological profile actually fits the crime scene evidence most closely has not yet been identified or charged. I want to be completely direct with you about something because this channel does not pretend to have answers it does not have, and it does not pretend that complexity is simple when complexity is the honest reality. The psychological assessment of Bryan Kohberger is that he is an unusual person. He is socially atypical. He has academic interests that make many people deeply uncomfortable. He exists at the edges of what most people would describe as conventional social behavior. And all of that, every single part of it, is completely irrelevant to whether he committed these murders. Unusual people are not dangerous people. People who study dark subjects academically are not dark people themselves. People who ask uncomfortable questions in the pursuit of legitimate research are not planning to do the things they are researching. The history of wrongful convictions in America is substantially written in the stories of people who were unusual, who did not fit social expectations, who made jurors uncomfortable on a gut level, and who were convicted not on solid and unambiguous evidence but on the basis of a feeling that someone that strange must have done something this terrible. That is not justice. That is pattern matching applied to a human life. And pattern matching has sent innocent people to death row before, and it will again unless juries are willing to hold the line on what beyond a reasonable doubt actually means. At the same time, none of that means Bryan Kohberger is innocent. The DNA evidence, whatever its documented limitations around touch DNA and chain of custody, placed biological material connected to his family line at the scene of 4 murders. The digital evidence placed his phone in proximity to the murder location repeatedly over months. The car, whatever the model year discrepancy that the defense has documented, was consistent in make and color with the vehicle observed near the house on the night of the murders. These are not nothing. They are imperfect. They are contested. They are in some cases potentially explainable through innocent means, but they are real pieces of evidence that a jury is going to have to weigh carefully. The prosecution has a real case. That case has real and documented problems. And 12 jurors are going to have to sit with both of those realities simultaneously and decide, beyond a reasonable doubt, which interpretation of the evidence they believe. The psychological profile does not give you the answer. What it gives you is an honest look at the complexity of a situation where a real human being, with a real and documented history, is accused of a real and devastating crime, and where the evidence is simultaneously pointing in multiple directions and refusing to resolve neatly in either direction. What I can tell you with confidence is this. The prosecution's attempt to transform Bryan Kohberger's academic interests and personality characteristics into evidence of guilt is not supported by the actual science of criminal profiling. Studying criminology does not make you a criminal. Being socially awkward and intellectually intense does not make you a killer. Finding dark subjects academically interesting does not mean you are capable of acting on that interest violently. A jury should be deeply and carefully cautious about convicting any person on the basis of who they are rather than on the basis of what the evidence conclusively and unambiguously shows they did. And what I can also tell you, with equal confidence, is this. For people were killed in that house on November 13, 2022, for families have been waiting for justice since that morning, and the only justice that actually matters, the only justice that means anything to those families and to the memory of Kaylee and Madison and Shauna and Ethan, is the kind of justice that reaches the right person, not the nearest available suspect, not the most convenient answer. The right person, whether that person is Bryan Kohberger. The trial will tell us. The psychological profile alone does not get us there, and anyone who tells you it does is not giving you the whole truth. Comment below right now. After everything you just heard, does Bryan Kohberger fit the psychological profile of the person who committed these murders? I want to know what you think. I want to know if the science shifted your perspective or if your gut is holding firm, because the comments on this video are going to tell me more about how people are processing this case than anything the media is covering. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Share this with someone who has been following the case closely, because when this trial begins, the psychological evidence is going to be front and center in the courtroom, and this channel is going to be the place that breaks it down with the depth and honesty it deserves. Kaylee Culvis, Madison Mogen, Shanna Colonel, Ethan Chapin, for people who should be alive right now, for families who deserve the truth arrived at honestly, carefully, and completely, not the version that is most convenient, not the answer that gives someone somewhere a feeling of closure, but the actual truth. That is the only thing any of them ever deserved. I'll see you in the next one.